back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. And with us today, we have Dr. Wesley Alexander Hill, who is a research associate and international program manager on energy growth and security program at the International Tax and Investment Center. I realize it's quite a mouthful, but we will momentarily understand what it all means. And we'll be talking with him about a very relevant topic, which is China and how its financial and economic situation and strategy feed into its geopolitics, its successes and losses in Africa and also elsewhere around the world. Thank you so much for joining the program today. Could you please tell us a little about yourself, your background, and how you got into this fascinating area, and also about your project and your current work?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to join you guys. So I'm Wesley Alexander Hill. I'm the lead analyst and international program manager for the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. If you don't like the mouthful, just EGS at ITIC is fine. So prior to this position, I was in academia. I did my doctoral work at Tulane University, and I've just had an abiding interest in China for an extremely long period of time. I just thought, going back decades at this point, that China was such an important actor in the international system, but it is so poorly understood, not just by the American public at large, which is at least somewhat understandable, but even policymakers don't have a fantastic grip on the diplomatic situation involving China, its internal politics, Chinese culture, etc. Most specifically, my day-to-day work, I work on a lot of China, Central Asia things. So even amongst experts that study either of these regions, I'm kind of the odd one out, and I like it. It's an interesting niche. Many people who studied Central Asia studied the Russian language. They started their work when Central Asia was still part of the Soviet Union, so they come at it from a very Russian-centric perspective. And many people who study China focus a lot on the Asia Pacific. They focus on the Taiwan Straits. They focus on China's relationship with Taiwan, maybe Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, etc. And these are important, but China also borders a bunch of other countries facing to its west that receive less engagement from the academic and policy communities. So that's broadly where I sit.
So you're also, I see, dealing a lot with the energy issues. How does that come in?
Sure. So we do many energy related projects. We do a lot of energy analysis. Aside from the traditional energy topics that you can imagine, nuclear, pipeline issues, all sorts of things that are very conventional. The cutting edge topics that we are working on all have to do with rare earth elements. And this is, again, where China comes into play. So for those of you that may not be aware, rare earth elements, also sometimes called critical minerals, are the mineral inputs that go into almost every advanced piece of technology you can think of. F-35 fighter jets, wind turbines, modern day televisions, superconductors, the latest computers, etc. They all use these rare earth elements. And rare earth elements are, depending on how you're measuring them, either 85 to 95% refined in China. And China is using this as a geopolitical weapon. And this is definitely a project that sort of combines a lot of my interests: energy policy, China, the global trade flows, architecture, etc. So that is definitely what is mostly animating our work recently. And for those of you that are interested in reading more about this topic, if you go to iticnet.org and the resources section, we have a report out recently about rare earth elements in Central Asia. And we have a discussion concurrent to that where we debuted the report at the Atlantic Council that is also findable.
Now, we are seeing right now a very, a very complicated dynamic between US and China related to economic and geopolitical interests. And it seems to me that it's not easy to separate various elements of the dynamic. The fact that U.S. is still very much a beneficiary of very significant Chinese investments. The fact, despite the efforts to decouple, some of the U.S. companies are very firmly embedded in China, at least for now. It's not easy to separate the fact that U.S. just, recently imposed tariffs on Chinese steel, which is being dumped, but nevertheless, China's dumping practices in other products and areas still continue unabated, and at the same time, the administration is trying to balance its interest in green energy projects with China, but also trying to get it to exercise its might in geopolitics, cut down on exports of various weapons components to Russia, try to curb Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, and so forth, with mixed results or no results really so far. So how do we explain this really complicated effort? Does it make sense from a policy perspective? Should there be another route to influencing China's behavior other than trying to work on some projects and then trying to get China to back off on other things?
Well, any policy that is applied in almost any circumstance is going to have to be pragmatic and is going to must have contours that conform to whatever the environment is. So in this case, you brought up a couple of issues. So on tariffs, for example, it makes perfect sense that some things would be, tariffed at a very high level and other things wouldn't. There is no universal policy solution to China because there's not really a universal policy solution to anything. But I think a lot of the incongruities that people are observing with China comes down to a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of what the United States envisions its economic relationship with China to be. So a lot of people think that the objective is decoupling, and that's not really the objective of decoupling with China. First of all, it's seen as incredibly difficult. Lots of consumer goods are made in China and they keep the prices low. And it's also not really feasible on the Chinese end because they import lots of American agricultural products, lots of American finished goods, higher end consumer goods, etc. So it's extremely difficult to totally decouple. And it's also not necessarily desirable, even if you could do it. The rationale is that countries that trade with each other tend not to go to war. And this is sort of the elephant in the room. Everyone is worried that the two biggest powers in the world with these fundamental disagreements will eventually have a great power conflict. There is a reason why Xi Jinping constantly talks about avoiding Thucydides' trap, which is the notion that two great powers are destined for war under most circumstances. Now, that said, there might not be total decoupling. The United States and China might be fine with trading things like consumer goods, T-shirts, consumer electronics, etc. But there is a lot of de-risking going on. So because there are these geopolitical disagreements and because the United States and China have mutual skepticism towards one another and a lot of cutting edge technologies, and they're worried what will happen if the other controls these technologies, you do see de-risking, a very intentional pulling apart of supply chains. And this is where you see decoupling in things like electric vehicles, steel, lots of solar panels, green earth, green technology, rare earth refining, etc. So it's not that there is incongruity in the strategy, it's that often the strategy is fundamentally misunderstood. We're not trying to totally decouple from China. Even if we could do it, it would probably not be worth it. It probably wouldn't be worth the pain. What we are trying to do is to ensure that these mutual disagreements that exist between China and the United States are managed, they're productively managed, and they are, disentangled without a lot of violence.
So meanwhile, turning back um, to kind of these geopolitical issues, we have seen repeated visits by U.S. Members of the U.S. administration trying to get China to influence other third parties like Iran and Houthi on issues vital to U.S. economic and national security concerns, as well as to get China to back off on some of its own direct operations and supplying countries like Russia and also Iran with various with the components, weapons components, with trade and so forth. What incentives does US have to offer to China, and at what cost would it come, and why is China likely to to really make an effort on these fronts?
Well, in terms of incentives for the US to do this, I mean, it doesn't really cost anything. There isn't any policymaker that comes up with any policy that says, okay, this will only work if China is involved on our side. There is no policy that is fully reliant on China in that regard. Now, that said, it would be fantastic if China would, align with American policy on things like Iran or instability in the Middle East, et cetera. And the reason why the United States makes these offers isn't always because we think China is going to do it. It is because the assessment of China is that it has a stake in the international system and that it might want to rearrange the international system, it may want to capture the international system, but it doesn't want to destroy it in the same way that, say, Russia has an interest in destroying huge parts of the international system in order to realize its personal geopolitical gains. China's interest in the wider geopolitical system can be met by mostly by working within it, even though there are areas, of course, where it diverges, the South China Sea, Xinjiang and Tibet issues, lots of WTO disputes, but these are mostly on the periphery.
So let's look at China's own interests in the matter. What would what what exactly is China looking for right now from these nebulous alliances? Given that Russia is a highly sanctioned entity on the one hand, Iran is as well. There's a lot of geopolitical risk of getting involved in these countries. There's a lot of business risk, reputational risk, and there's also a risk that the conflicts between US and these countries can get out of control. The Houthis alone have accidentally attacked Chinese ships, even with political understandings and agreements. What is China looking to gain from such problematic relationships?
The Chinese assessment is that however problematic these relationships are, the US isn't willing to pull the final trigger, so to speak. China wants quite simply resources, commodities, and economic development mostly from these relationships. That's why it has a relationship with Iran. It's why it brokered Saudi-Iranian rapprochement last year. It's why it is, buying so much Russian hydrocarbons. And it's because it needs it. China is an energy importer. It imports a lot of its energy, even though it's, it's increasing its coal capacity, nuclear power, green energy, et cetera. It's still very energy poor, and it imports a lot of energy. Because of that, its assessment is that, well, we could either abide by these American sanctions and not work with Iran, and in which case we're directly competing with American and European energy demands, or we could just go to, say, Iran or other sanctioned entities like Russia and buy these things on the cheap. That said, it's not only economic. That would be a little bit reductionist. China does see itself as a rising great power. There's a lot of confidence in China's revival after the century of humiliation. So it sees these sorts of relationships with Iran or North Korea or Russia as, these are the rights of China to have these relationships. We will do with these relationships whatever we will. And even if these relationships are ambiguous, there's not the political dimension isn't often fully expunged upon, and often there would be fundamental differences of opinion between, say, the leader of a theocratical regime in Iran versus, Chairman Xi. It doesn't really matter because it's a prestige project at the end of the day. The strategic leverage has not yet materialized. So there's not really a situation where, oh, now there's a bunch of Chinese troops in Iran or something like that. That's not existent yet. Could that happen? Sure. but I don't, it's not on the short-term agenda of China. China still has tremendous economic problems. Its woes are more readily apparent now.
So let's speak about those woes in a little bit more depth. For a while now, we've been hearing somewhat alarming reports about the burst of the real estate bubble inside China, the lack of opportunities for younger people who've been forced to come out of, various foreign gained degrees and go into agriculture and farming, or simply not have a job at all. We've been hearing all sorts of internal problems, along with the crackdown on foreign companies that provide some of these opportunities, and in general, kind of all sorts of financial restrictions. So how do we balance this China's efforts to stay on top of its game as a financial superpower, to be able to expend the money it needs for its various geopolitical projects, and this internal security kind of crackdown, and that's really, really costing it in various ways?
Well, the answer is that they're not at all contradictory, and they're often part of the same process. So if one recalls a much more benign example, say Japan in the 1970s and 1980s, before the so-called lost decade, there was a tremendous worry in the West, especially the United States, about Japanese exports. They bought Madison Square Garden for a while in New York City, and everyone thought, oh my gosh, the Japanese economy is going sky high. It's going to all of these foreign aid or all these foreign projects Japan is doing. It's a symptom of Japanese strength. But what we understand in retrospect is that it was a symptom of Japanese weakness. It's because there was not enough internal aggregate demand to deal with Japan's overcapacity, which is a word that we're hearing again with China. And as a result, Japan went out searching for foreign markets. It was looking for places to invest. It had too much capital on hand and not enough ways to productively use the capital. And ultimately, all of these dynamics combined and stalled the Japanese economy for over a decade. What we're seeing is a sort of version of this. It's not a one-to-one ratio because the economies are very different. China is much more able to sort of pull on the international market to stimulate demand because of its population. But it's a similar story. So you look at these foreign projects that China is doing, especially in infrastructure, and one might conclude, oh, well, China must have all of this money. Its infrastructure must be perfect, et cetera. But a lot of the foreign infrastructure construction that is happening now, not in the past, say, 10 or 15 years, which may have been more politically oriented, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. But a lot of the recent infrastructure is probably being spurred on by the fact that infrastructure construction in China is having lower and lower rates of return. So circa, 20 years ago, $1 or excuse me, $15 in infrastructure construction got you about $1 in returns within a year, which is a fantastic direct rate of return for infrastructure. It pays for itself quite rapidly. Uh, that number has been declining. Local government debt has been climbing. So as a result, you turn to other available markets, the foreign market. But this is sort of a temporary solution. It does not solve the fundamental domestic incongruities in the Chinese economy. And this is even more dangerous and more risky in some ways than the Japanese problem that we saw uh, 20, 30 years ago at this point, because China still has significant elements of state planning in its economy. There are state-owned enterprises that occupy the commanding heights of the economy. As a result, these tensions within the Chinese economy can cause significant problems. Now, having said all of that, I still do want to make a caveat that none of these problems are insurmountable. And in fact, I think it's quite likely that they will be surmounted, so to speak. There is an old saying, an old adage that economists have predicted 5 of the last 3 recessions. And it's also true with China. So China has had significant problems with the real estate market, but this was also a story that started a couple years ago. China's real estate market is inflated, but it doesn't appear to be taking down the entire economy with it. China's local governments are very in debt. They have significant problems with rates of return. Beijing is not happy about this, but these are being slowly dealt with. And you can also see the results of this, that China's economy is growing much slower than it was in the last 10 years or so. but it's still growing, and it's growing higher than the population rate is growing. So it's not all doom and gloom, even if there are problems ahead for China.
Interestingly enough, some sectors of the economy, some industries rather, that you mentioned that rely on foreign export are now booming. The EV market, for instance, as well as some of the phones that China is able to capitalize on, in part thanks to its much easier access to raw materials than the US, for instance, and thus cut down on costs, and in part thanks to the wonders of industrial espionage of and the modeling after Western models. But nevertheless, whatever the reasons for it, these markets are quite successful. They're gaining a lot, especially in non-Western world. Just how far can these successes take China? Do you see limits to where these developments can compensate for the financial issues in other sectors?
Oriented growth has a problem in that it is very difficult to stimulate aggregate demand, consumer demand. Taiwan ran into this problem, South Korea ran into this problem, Japan ran into this problem, and China is running into this problem. China's solution to this, and it remains to be seen whether this will work. There are good reasons to think it won't, but China and the many people within the Communist Party think that more elements of state planning, especially on the domestic consumer side, will solve the problems of China's middle class not really growing. So what we're seeing inside of China itself is a sort of reemergence of elements of state planning that we did not really see since Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms began in earnest in the early 1980s. So under Xi Jinping, for example, lots of internal companies that basically sold things to Chinese consumers and didn't really have anything to do with exports were grouped together. Even if so new state umbrella organizations were created. Utility companies within China that were supposed to provide cheaper industrial inputs for Chinese companies servicing locals were also grouped into bigger and bigger amalgamations under a familiar logic to those of us that have studied command economies from history, that larger units of production will be easier to scale, manage, produce returns on investment, equipment, etc. The argument is that unlike in the past, there is now way more market input. It is not a wholly command economy. Most people in China, especially even in the Communist Party, don't want to return to total market total planning, but they want to introduce more planning. And also part of that is that there is an ideological proclivity to it. They are at the end actually communists, even though they are much more pragmatic than, say, Mao's generation would have seen them. So whether this will succeed, it remains to be seen. Again, the big advantage that they have that the Soviet Union didn't is that there are lots of ways, especially computerized ways, for Chinese consumers to offer inputs on goods. So, for example, WeChat, it is a super app inside of China that if you've ever been to China, you use to communicate. You can pay your bills on it. You can buy stuff on it. You can plan your travel on it. You can do almost anything on it. Some places are debuting features with WeChat where you can report the stuff you're using. So a Facebook for goods. And if this is successful, then China thinks, oh, well, we'll be able to analyze how much goods people are using, and we can calibrate the economy appropriately. Whether it will work, there's many good reasons to be skeptical.
Now, interestingly enough, in recent years, China has had several corruption crackdowns. Many people have been skeptical whether it's really as much about corruption as about ideological and political purges. But whatever the case may be, now that this element of state planning is being reintroduced, it certainly opens up new avenues for state officials in charge with this sort of planning to exercise a great deal more control, individual influence, and collective committee influence over these things, and certainly opens up new avenues for state corruption as well. So how does China look to balance these two goals, limiting corruption and self-enrichment and so forth, while also planning out these elements and compensating for losses.
So you are correct that it is very easy for bad actors to capture parts of an apparatus if it is a command economy. But recent Chinese experience makes this less of a fear for them. So if you ask any Chinese person, when was the economy the most corrupt? When was there the most government corruption in recent memory? They'll tell you, oh, it was like the mid 90s, early mid 90s, all the way like through the 90s to the 2000s. And this was the heyday of Chinese economic reforms. You had people like the Zhao Ziyang, who, his successors, his ideological heir apparents, Jiang Zemin, who were embracing the market. Uh, but but there was still a lot of corruption. Now, this isn't because the market necessarily caused all this corruption. There were a lot of good reasons the corruption happened. But the recent Chinese experience was, well, the market came and corruption happened. We pulled a little bit back from the market in the early 2000s, especially under the tenure of Hu Jintao. And that's when China had its most fantastic period of economic growth. Year over year, roughly 10% between 1999 and 2008, 2009. Tremendous growth. So the recent Chinese experience has been market introduction in the 1980s, fantastic growth. Market continues in the 90s. You still have fantastic growth, but way more corruption. To early 2000s, market is reined in, still have fantastic growth, but less corruption. And now 2010s, you have still pretty good growth and less corruption than before. So they're not worried about what the dynamic you mentioned because they fundamentally reject the premise of your question. That would be the easiest way to answer it. Now, one could argue that these are incorrect analyses. Oh, the market has these sorts of things. It could be that market activity within the structure of this Chinese state inherently creates corruption, and maybe this isn't the fault of the market. But it's just hundreds of millions of people would disagree with us, and the Communist Party knows this.
Mm-hmm.
And as for the dimension of political purges that you talked about, it's absolutely true that many of these political purges are the result of Xi Jinping finding a political enemy and needing to get rid of him. They're not as widespread as, say, the big purges from history, like the anti-rightist campaign, or going back even further, the Great Purge under Stalin in the Soviet Union. But they're still there and they happen and they're a way of life. But it's mostly confined to elite actors within the Communist Party and elite actors in civil society and business and things like that. They have not spread out to the rest of society.
So would it be fair to say that the way currently the CCP is going is actually they're managing to balance things well enough that the overall society accepts that direction, that it hasn't caused enough of a financial pain or duress or even a political duress overall for the general population to be strongly opposed to what's going on.
Correct. I mean, I would focus on what you said, strongly opposed. So there are hundreds of millions of people who do not like this aspect or that aspect of the Chinese Communist Party. But in recent memory, most people's experience with the Chinese Communist Party has been okay. They're kind of annoying on social issues, but they're not too overbearing. They're authoritarian, but at least the economy is growing, and I don't know if I want to mess that up. The last time we had these political campaigns inside of China with mass movements, they were associated with the Cultural Revolution, which ended very poorly. And worse, before that, there was the Great Leap Forward. So, if not supportive, there's a lot of passivity. And as long as the economy keeps growing, that will likely continue. But that said, this is not a universal opinion. The more educated, more cosmopolitan middle classes that are present on China's eastern seaboard and big international cities like Beijing and Shanghai, et cetera, they tend to be a little more skeptical, but they're also paradoxically parts of them are the biggest recipients of government largesse, government, government enabled social rank. So because of this, there isn't really a single constituency you can point to in China and say, oh, the middle class is against the government, or oh, the lower class is against the government. There is there is plenty of opposition, but there's mostly pacific. There's mostly apathy. That said, you have already pointed out a couple of issues that China is having difficulty solving. Aggregate demand, I keep going back to it, is one of the reasons why it's having these problems with youth unemployment. It's having problems in regions of the country because a lot of the economic development is very focused on the eastern seaboard. You can get on a train in Beijing, which has a purchasing power parity per capita of roughly around the level of Italy. You ride a couple of hours west, you go to say Gansu, rural Gansu, and you're on the level of some Latin American countries. So it's a very stark divide between the wealth of the cities and the poverty of the interior. So there's plenty of problems for China to deal with, plenty of problems to overcome still.
Speaking of aggregate demand, one of the issues that came to prominence in particular last year was the concern about the foreign capital flight after certain measures were imposed and how China was trying to restructure towards more domestic investments. What was finally the outcome of that, and has that issue balanced itself out or recalibrated in any way?
Well, what you saw was you saw a lot of foreign capital that was thinking of investing or invested in specific industries flee all at once. And what you've seen subsequently is that there's lots of fixed assets inside of China, mostly factories, that it doesn't make any sense to move these assets. It doesn't make any sense to dismantle these assets. So they are continuing on as before, but maintenance is being deferred. There's not really any prospects for expansion on a lot of these assets. So they're trudging forward. Foreign capital remains involved. It seems to be going forward at sort of an existing rate, but it doesn't want to expand at all. And this is a big problem because if you want to stimulate, more economic growth, foreign capital is very useful. And if you, inadvertently or not drive away a lot of foreign investment, you're going to impact trade flows. So China's export-oriented economy, it's going to find it increasingly difficult to export to states in the global south if it is, severing foreign capital flows.
So now looking at what's happening outside, I mean, China is still very much a huge financial force regionally, but it has also tried to go far beyond its own local, Asian sphere of influence in the Pacific, that area, and into Africa, into Latin America, other regions. And we've heard a lot about the limits and also the successes in those areas, that some of the countries in Africa have supposedly become more skeptical of China's investments, that there's been pushback, and also that there's been limitations to the capital to invest into the BRI in general. To what extent are these domestic balancing issues affecting the foreign outcomes, and to what extent is that affecting China's perception on the international scene?
So couple of things. So first, we need to bifurcate the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative, when it was launched over a decade ago at this point, wow, time flies. The Belt and Road Initiative had the characteristics that many people think it still has. Like, oh, China comes in with an army of its own laborers. This army of laborers builds a road to somewhere, opens a mine. The laborers, they don't employ lots of locals. There's lots of in-kind exchanges. So maybe China wants a port, maybe China is doing something with, the string of pearl strategy, etc. And then China leaves and, it has this economic asset after it's paid rent. That was certainly true of early Chinese economic activity in the Belt and Road Initiative. But what we've seen is that it has changed over time. So last year, when the Belt and Road 2.0 was renewed, what we're seeing is actually a convergence of methodology. So it turned out after significant financial problems with the first Belt and Road Initiative set of programs. Of course, there were successes. I'm not discounting those, but a lot of the problems China discovered was, oh, there were actually reasons why the West was doing things the way it wasn't. It wasn't, some sort of insidious political
Mhm.
project, but maybe we can do things still better. So Belt and Road 2.0 looks a lot like something the USAID or the Export Import Bank or the EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. It's much more similar to those types of projects than it actually is to the first generation of the Belt and Road Initiative. I bring this up because it explains a lot about persistingly positive attitudes towards China. So if you look at Afrobarometer, for example, which is a public affairs monitor of African public opinion, I don't want to quote the exact numbers. I don't want to give wrong statistics, but I do remember the relative weight of these. But a large majority of Africans say they want more trade with China. The same set of Africans say they do not think China is a superior developmental model to the West. And they do not, most Africans say they would much prefer a Western style multi party democracy, political liberalism. So because of this, Africa's its incentives are very different from the United States or China. It wants to develop. It wants to continue its economic development and maintain the gains it has in political democracy that it has undergone since the 1990s, though there have been recent backsliding in this front, especially in the Sahel region, where we saw a series of coups. But Sahel region aside, the African continent is still developing a lot. It is still taking in a lot of foreign trade, but it's not seeking to emulate China. And what we've seen in this regard is that politically, it seems that the honeymoon period with China is over. A lot of African countries, which have very little, if any, historical trade links with China, very few prior associations, started trading with China and thought, oh, well, it's going to be a fundamentally different experience trading with China than it is the West. Well, if you recall what I just said about the Belt and Road 2.0 converging with USAID, turns out that's not the case. This is just a function of mathematics. It's just a function of structure and economics and supply and demand, et cetera. So because it's looking very much the same, just like you're trading with Germany or the US or a Western actor, African states are more skeptical towards China than before. But I think again, it's more like the end of a honeymoon than it is revulsion. Uh, Now that said, there are a few outstanding examples in Africa of intense political distrust. So Ethiopia, for example, when it was governed, it was intentionally trying to build a so-called party state, and like China did, especially with the ERPDF, the Ethiopian or excuse me, EPRDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which governed the country from the end of Mengistu Haile Mariam's regime until very recently. It was emulating China politically in a way that no other African country was. And Ethiopia still collapsed into its current civil difficulties. That probably wasn't the fault of the Chinese system it was trying to emulate it. It did not emulate it in all ways on all levels, but it creates a very bad example for Africans, where if you have this showpiece where the African Union built its new headquarters in Addis Ababa, and it has collapsed, and now there's a civil conflict again that it supposedly had banished, and it would banish through the implementation of a party state. It doesn't send a good message.
Now, do you expect a sort of BRI 3.0? Do you expect China to evolve its strategy in Africa in particular to adjust for new developments? For instance, the race that the US is finally entering, or other actors and middle powers becoming more prominent?
Belt and Road 2.0 is still very young, so I don't think the 3.0 version is going to be with us for a while. But you are correct in that the US is much more involved in Africa now than it was 10, 15 years ago. So there is the Lobito corridor in Angola, which runs through central Angola to critical mineral mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the Katanga region, or the Katanga and Kasai regions of the DRC. And this was a project that China had, maybe tried to stymie behind closed doors through its contacts with the Angolan government, but it did not succeed. And in December of 2022, there was a very large meeting of African leaders here in Washington, D.C., the African Leaders Summit, with American counterparts and also Joe Biden, where a lot of agreements were signed between the United States and African states on, various types of cooperative agreements, everything from resource agreements, mining, transit, human capital, training, security, etc. So the United States is gaining in Africa, and it's largely because the honeymoon with China for African states is over, and also it just took a while for the U.S. to sort of take the China Africa dimension very seriously.
Now, we have seen China invest in very traditional type of infrastructural project. Do we foresee kind of a shift, an economic shift to startups, as China is vying for primacy in the AI sector, other cutting edge development projects? Is it seeking out these types of more risky but also more potentially rewarding opportunities?
It really isn't, not yet, because those are very difficult to use as political weapons. So I will give you a concrete example. So in Sierra Leone, the Chinese built a massive hospital. There was a ribbon cutting ceremony, and it was very good for Chinese influence in Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, China said, this hospital is brought to you by the Chinese people, the Chinese government. Enjoy. The problem was there were no nurses, there wasn't medical supplies, there wasn't a lot of training to use it, and none of this is not necessarily the fault of the Chinese building the hospital. It's still a good thing to build the hospital, even if it's not fully up to standards, but it's also not necessarily the best use of resources. So what the United States was able to do was, well, actually train a bunch of nurses to run this hospital in Sierra Leone and make sure it had medical equipment and stuff. So people might remember the ribbon cutting ceremony and the big sign in Chinese characters that said it, the Sierra Leone Chinese Friendship Hospital, if I recall its name correctly. But the actual soft power gains were because the United States was investing in less obvious forms, but still very important forms of soft power. So China in general opts for big economic projects that could potentially reshape the flow of trade, like a road or a port or a railroad, or big infrastructure projects that are very obvious, a hospital, a bridge, etc. The United States and the West in general do these sometimes. It's generally not the core competency, but they are done, as we can see with the Lobedo corridor in Angola. But more often than not, it is ancillary services that have a lot of force multiplicative effects that the West engages with. So training nurses, incubators, startups, best practices for everything from police training to accounting to scientific knowledge like geology and these sorts of things. And some of these China is, totally disinterested. Some of them China is competitive. So lots of African students go to China to study lots of topics, especially the sciences. And in some of them, China is dominant, like you said, traditional infrastructure. So the question remains, are they really going to divest from this traditional infrastructure? And it seems like no, because there has not yet been a case where these best practices things that China is talking about or trains people, they don't appear to really stick. The governments would rather work with the United States, work with the West. As we mentioned with this Afrobarometer poll, I keep going back to, the West is still seen as a superior form of a developmental model, even though China is seen as very, very positively. So it's unlikely that China is going to diversify this. And partly because these sensitive topics that you brought up when you talked about, like, say, AI, China doesn't think its AI development is going to be really intertwined with its foreign policy or incubating this in some foreign country. It thinks AI is going to be the result of its state organized new Silicon Valley, basically. And it doesn't think it's going to be an incubator.
Well, that's a categorically different approach from what the US is taking, which is actually doing both. We have our own AI companies here, but US is also using them as an instrument of investment into countries like UAE, where there is a significant level of Chinese presence, not in AI, but in other areas, and where it's hoping to ensure that those AI developments don't end up in China's hands and later when it comes to that point. So that's a very interesting distinction worth noting. But for China, Africa as a continent has been a big focus in because of ultimately the resources. All these infrastructural investments show it could be a good source of money, control of the ports, military strategy, but also the resources that are basically fundamental parts of the economy, whether it's decarbonization projects or weapons or anything else. There is this race for the resources, and US has also tried to sign MOUs with the DRC, with Zambia, with all these countries, but China is very much in control. But on the other hand, we are also seeing that there may be some competition with Russia, which previously was more complementary, and now as Russia is also looking towards the same mines, there could be some tensions. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how can US exploit that situation if it can?
So first I'll touch on Russia very briefly because it's a different phenomenon. But
Mm-hmm.
Russia is essentially engaged in basically dealing with very small groups of discontent military officers, Praetorian Guard formations in Sahel states, and it is using these personal connections to basically enrich a small group of people in those states so that Russia itself can take a lot of these very quickly, very fungible things out of these states. So, Russia isn't getting, these rare earth elements that need to be refined and put into a, big valuable process or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. It is essentially taking gold, ivory, gems, etc. Things, or even things like iron. Like it doesn't have to be the sexy, valuable minerals. It just wants things that are very quickly fungible onto the market. It's not a long-term strategy; it's a short-term strategy because Russia is having problems in Ukraine and it needs money. So, but that's a very different phenomenon than what the United States and China are doing because both of them are investing in Africa for the long form, and China and the United States are also broadly concerned with what African public opinion thinks of them. I mean, it's not the only concern. They're not do neither side is doing this out of the goodness of their heart, but they are cognizant that African public support can make or break operations in one country or another. So as for really what this means in the long term and in terms of who's going to come out on top and what this relationship is going to look like, it's very difficult to say. Uh, it's very difficult to say mostly because the way that China thought things were going to shape out and the way that the United States actually thought that things were going to shape out for China were both fundamentally wrong. China did not reorient all the trade and economic activity in sub-Saharan Africa towards China, and neither were Chinese activities so repulsive to Africans that they never wanted to,
Mm-hmm.
speak with Beijing again. So because there's this ongoing competition, there's this ongoing middle ground of investment in all types, even though there are relative specializations like we touched upon earlier, it's very difficult to say how it'll ultimately go. I will say one thing though, that if any listener is interested more in the Russian aspect of this and the coups in the Sahel, I wrote some articles in the National Interest. You can just search National Interest Wesley Alexander Hill, and there will be a couple of articles there about Russian activity in sub-Saharan Africa.
So you don't see China engaging in any sort of government meddling other than outright just low-level propaganda for its own benefit or any sort of political pressure in Africa. Do you see it as sticking strictly to economic type of influence?
Well, I think China hopes that through economic influence it can gain political influence, but it actually already has tried politically influencing things. So, of course, there's the BRICS organization. The BRICS organization has many problems. It's not institutionalized, it might be redundant, it has imaging problems. Many of its members don't like each other, but South Africa is in BRICS, and it is an attempt to sway Africa. Before the coup in Zimbabwe that ultimately removed Robert Mugabe, Constantino Chiwenga, who was the person who facilitated the coup and removed Robert Mugabe, traveled to Beijing. And he traveled to Beijing and he probably was looking for Chinese support for the coup. We don't know for certain. Intelligence agencies probably know for certain, but it seems very likely that China was involved there. In Angolan elections, the recent elections between the MPLA, which is the Movement for the Popular Liberation of Angola. Once upon a time, it enjoyed support from the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War rivalry, and it fought a proxy war against the losers in the election, UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, which received Western support during this pretty bitter civil war and proxy war, but also at one point actually received Chinese support because of Sino-Soviet rivalry. It's very likely, though, again, this is not confirmed. China would certainly deny it. It seemed very likely that China put its thumb on the scale in support of the MPLA, though it probably regrets that now if it did so because of the Lobito corridor, and that help didn't seem enough to ward off American influence. There's less credible but still possible allegations that China was doing something similar in Tanzania. Tanzania and China have a very long and deep history, going back to the Nyerere administration, which was the first independent government in Tanzania after the end of British colonialism. Uh, its policy of Ujma, which is sort of like Swahili for family socialism, very consciously emulated Maoist China. It did not work. It did not work for similar reasons why Maoism in China did not really work and killed many people. But it created a deep and lasting legacy. So the political party that rose out of that, CCM, the Party of the Revolution, was the English translation for it, uh, supposedly had very close relations with China. But then one of the leaders of the CCM died from COVID-19, and that appears to have derailed the Chinese Tanzanian relationship project, though they're still very close. And again, those are less credible allegations. And you see these sorts of allegations all over Africa, like, oh, China's here, China's there, China's there. They have less, some are more credible, some are less credible. We don't know for certain what is or is not true. It won't be certain until it's a matter of the historical record. But it's quite likely that China is already trying to, politically influence things and use political methods to advance economic methods. That said, will it ever be as brazen as, say, Russia, where Russia is going in with the Africa Corps and supporting a coup and selling regime security to the highest bidder? Probably not. It's not in China's interest to sort of do this slash and burn thing.
So to add just one more element to this already complicated the interplay between politics and economics, that's the element of course, military might. And China has already, a base in Djibouti. It has been looking towards other bases. One of them was scuttled at one point in time. But it's certainly looking to become a major naval power. It's looking towards Red Sea, towards the Middle East as well. So where do these political and economic elements, how are they advantageous? And on the other hand, what challenges can we expect, especially given the current economic context?
Quite honestly, I would not be terribly concerned with direct Chinese presence militarily in sub-Saharan Africa or really anywhere else, because China thinks it's playing a very long game and it's going to win in the economic space. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, the Chinese base in Djibouti, it's like literally right down the road from the German base and the EU mission, and then there's the U.S. base, and there's all of these bases in Djibouti. Djibouti is right at the entrance of the Red Sea, right next to two different problem areas for piracy, Yemen and Somalia. That's really the purpose it serves. It's a very minor base, and it's also actually not that strategically useful. People who maybe really don't know anything about military theory think, "Oh my God, it's such an access point," but it really isn't, because if you want to, control the Red Sea, you also need the Suez Canal, which is right up there. And controlling one end of the sea without the other is gives you very nothing except access to the coastline of southern Egypt, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. So, I wouldn't really actually be too worried about it. Could this change theoretically? But there are so many logistical nightmare steps in the way from this, like say the Malacca problem, where China has to transit through a pretty narrow strait in south of Malaysia to get into the Indian Ocean, or various other straits in Indonesia. Or the fact that there's a string of islands that that China feels is pinning them in, stretching from Japan to Taiwan and to the Philippines. There are all of these other proximate military problems and obstacles that China having a couple of isolated bases overseas, like, in Djibouti, or very recently there was talk of China having a base in, southern Argentina, which probably, or excuse me, southern Chile. Um, I wouldn't be too worried about it, because they're not interconnected. They're very isolated outposts. What people should be concerned about, and what is more important, is China's economic growth, China's economic influence, the political rivalry between the U.S. and China.
So would it be fair to say that all this talk from certain right-wing circles about China's imminent economic collapse are greatly exaggerated?
Absolutely. And I think there's a very human reason why. It's that people are very rarely punished for making wrong predictions. So there are certain prominent geopolitical theorists who I won't name, but every year they'll say next year China's going to collapse. And they produce very flashy YouTube videos, and it's very clickbaity. And, based on these predictions, China should have collapsed around 20 times by now. And it's sort of absurd. At this point, there's so many predictions about China collapsing that even if somebody found proof that it was really going to happen, nobody would believe them, because it's the boy who cried wolf. So I always just ask myself this: what's more likely, that this country that has developed tremendously over the past 30 years, has had the highest rate of economic growth aggregate over decades in history, and has changed the lives of more people than any other time in human history, and ended more absolute poverty than any other government in history? What's more likely, that this government is going to run into problems but still probably continue on and muddle through these problems, or is it going to collapse spectacularly? And it just seems like the former is way more rational and way more reasonable.
So, from the same people, there's also been a lot of talk about Russia's penetration of different industries, a completely legitimate concern that I'm very sympathetic with. But what strikes me as interesting is the layer of this that's kind of lesser discussed. We're talking about, most people talk about just standard espionage, stealing of technologies, wooing away of some professionals to China, a problem in itself. I am looking also more at the kind of penetration of the industries of the sector itself, less about the individual acquisitions of intellectual property or weapons and things like that, and more about China's ability to send massive amounts of resources, intelligence resources, scientists, entire academia, and kind of have them serve as very specific, concrete purpose towards very concrete economic and political ventures. So that aspect of it, I feel, is not getting a lot of attention, and I think it's a very, very major point of China's geopolitical strategy. But I think it's also less flashy than simple, the act of spying in itself. So how do we kind of highlight this issue, and how do we come to understand it in light of China's overall strategy?
It's very difficult to highlight the issue, like you said, because until it personally affects people, they they may not care, or they may want solutions that are worse than the disease. So, for example, China very consciously inculcated its electric vehicle industry. And it probably did that with a little bit of industrial espionage, but it was mostly just industrial policy. The answer to this is not, as former President Donald Trump has said in front of people in certain swing states. It's probably not a good idea to have a 100% tariff on Chinese automobiles. Tariffs cause all sorts of problems in the economy. I don't want to get too sidetracked on there,
Mm.
uh, but but that would be very damaging. But it's intuitive. It feels good, like how we're going to stop these unfair trade practices, even though the method in which he has promised to stop these unfair trade practices would be disastrous, even to the very people it's meant to help. So, how do you make people care about this? I actually think that people are already caring about this. It's just they may not care about the specifics. So, what I mean is that there is a broad consciousness that China is an economic and geopolitical adversary of the United States. Now, people might not think, or they might not know specifically every detail of this. They might not know about the critical minerals refining monopoly or disputes over EVs or this and that railway corridor in Africa. Uh, but they do understand that there is a competition between the US and China, and there is a prima facie skepticism in the United States, a bipartisan skepticism towards China that is shared. So because that exists, I kind of think that's almost the most we can hope for. That to ask people to be alert, to ask people to watch out, sort of keep an eye open, and if you hear something that's maybe a little strange or why is China or President Xi doing this? You might think, okay, well, I'll be skeptical. So I actually think that in terms of what we can expect from the general public, uh, I think we're already there. Because when you think about it, I mean, we're sitting here talking in our specialized bubble about China and Africa and Central Asia and energy, but most people have other jobs. And if we were talking about something totally different, biology or something like that, we both probably just have a surface level understanding of biology, but hopefully enough to know, like, oh, you should wash your hands and get your vaccines and stuff like that. So I think for all practical terms and purposes, we're pretty much already at the position where I think it's okay for the general public vis-a-vis watching out for China.
Well, you underscored something very important, which is the industrial policy. We talk about all the things that China does wrong, that are bad, that we want punished, which is understandable. That's the natural human instinct to focus on the wrongdoing, because then you can get people outraged, and then it's easier to formulate your own policy. But what about all the things that China is doing right towards these ends? The fact that it does understand the importance of resourcing particular sectors appropriately, the fact that it has prioritized on the government level AI investments and has prioritized the massive undertaking. We may not like that they're sending all these spies and academics and entire industries, but the fact is it is working in some regard. How so while we are busy being outraged, China is busy, and US is not nearly there in terms of reorientation of its own sectors, and it's harder for the US to do so because it also has private agendas and interests in private industry that are not necessarily fully aligned with government objectives and concerns. So that misalignment, I think, is that sphere that's very hard to sell because it's expensive, and B, it's also just it's hard to pinpoint exactly. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how much resources we need. Do we need to be? We don't have millions of people to send on infiltrating academia and taking everything over. We are not an authoritarian state that can afford, can do things like that. So this particular aspect of China's policy, how do we either match or understand in a way that we can overcome in some other way?
Well, so there's a quote by Adolf Hitler, I think, that actually fits here quite well. And it said that one of the insidious strengths of the totalitarian system is that it tempts its adversaries into emulating it, which is not the correct answer. I do not, trying to sort of outcompete China in the ways that China is attempting to outcompete us, whether that's on privacy rights, whether that's on industrial policy is a fundamentally flawed assumption. So I will talk to policymakers or people around in Washington D.C. and we'll talk about some specific issue, and they'll say, "Oh, if only we could put more money towards this, or only if we could do that," and blah blah blah. There's a little bit of authoritarian envy, I would say, uh, and I think that's the wrong way to think about it. China has a very long-term strategy. It has a long-term strategy, and like you said, integrating supply chains, educating its populace, developing native technologies, etc. What we need to do for our own long-term priorities is to develop a civil society that is appropriately skeptical towards China, not paranoid. There should still be some cooperation, both for humanitarian reasons on things like research and diseases, that sort of thing, but also for pragmatic reasons, as we discussed with the decoupling versus de-risking dynamics. But to build a civil society that is confident in its democratic values, isn't afraid to stand up for these democratic values, and isn't afraid to compete with Chinese businesses, whether they're state owned or otherwise, overseas. But this also does require an active industrial policy from agencies like the Export Import Bank or the Development and Finance Corporation, et cetera, that can advise and assist American stakeholders or entrepreneurs on competing with China by informing them, by giving them tools, resources, et cetera. So I know that the answer that I have just given is almost vague and it's pretty unsatisfying because people are always hoping that there is this one silver bullet. And if we find the right specific policy, we're going to finally outcompete China. And it's all going to go back to the 1950s when we didn't have to worry about any industrial competitors. And that's simply not going to happen. People should not expect a sort of triumph over China in the way that there was like a triumph over the Soviet Union. China's here for the long haul. It has been a unified political entity for most of human history. It was arguably a nation state starting roughly 2,000 years ago with the Han Dynasty. China is going to be involved in the international economy, bar some sort of extremely drastic civil collapse and disorder. It should be anticipated that China is going to have to be in the room with any discussion. And Americans will have to be used to that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean compromising ideals or interests.
Well, thank you so much for this much more realistic assessment of the situation because, as I always say, you can't really solve a problem if you don't even understand what it actually is, and I think what people think the problem is not necessarily what the reality is. I think there's been a lot of concentrated, very congratulatory groupthink on China, and I think for that reason people have put a lot of faith into some sort of a political solution based on wishful thinking and not really understanding the level of deep engagement and a level of popular support and backing that China actually has. I think these two factors are kind of missing from a lot of the current policy making understanding. And I think it's very helpful to actually deal with reality and not with things that might feel good but are not really going to get us anywhere. So thank you for that, and for everyone watching, we will be back, of course, next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. the Washington Outsider Report, and thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.